Russia thought it had the Black Sea figured out. It had turned a stolen oil platform into a spy tower. It had loaded that platform with radars and jamming equipment so powerful that anything Ukraine fired toward Crimea could be scrambled, knocked sideways, or just turned into a flying brick. Russia was sitting pretty, watching the ocean, convinced that its electronic shield was untouchable. Then, on the night leading into April 6, 2026, something hit that platform so hard and so fast that Russia did not see it coming. Not because the attack was invisible, because the weapon behind it was a complete surprise. Ukraine had just used a missile that nobody publicly knew it had. A missile with a name pulled straight from Norse mythology. A missile so effective that it did not just destroy a target, it ripped a hole in Russia's entire defensive strategy for the Black Sea. The weapon is called Gungnir. In ancient Norse legend, Gungnir is the magical spear of Odin, the king of the gods. It never misses. It always returns. It cannot be stopped. Russia is now finding out what that feels like in real life. What happened on April 6 was not just a strike on an oil rig. It was Ukraine's announcement to the world that its arsenal just got a lot more dangerous. It was proof that Sweden, a country that spent 200 years staying out of everybody's wars, has decided that staying quiet is no longer an option. And it was a warning to Putin that the weapons pipeline flowing into Ukraine is nowhere close to running dry. So let us break this down from the very beginning. Because to understand why this one missile strike matters so much, you need to know what was sitting on that platform, why Russia needed it so badly, and exactly what kind of weapon Ukraine just used to turn it into a burning wreck in the middle of the Black Sea. Russia's floating spy tower. Before it became a military outpost, the Swedish was just an oil drilling platform. It sits in the Black Sea, roughly 60 to 80 kilometers northwest of Crimea. Russia seized it in 2014 when it grabbed Crimea, and drilling pretty much stopped after that. But Russia had other plans for Swedish, very useful plans. Over time, Russian forces turned that platform into something far more valuable than an oil rig. They loaded it up with radars that could track aircraft and incoming missiles from miles away. They installed electronic warfare systems powerful enough to interfere with GPS signals across a wide area. They turned a piece of rusting offshore infrastructure into a floating military base, positioned perfectly to guard Crimea from anything Ukraine might throw at it. Think about what that means in practice. If Ukraine wanted to fire a drone or a missile at a target near Crimea, that drone or missile had to fly into range of Swedish first. And once it got close enough, Swedish's jamming systems would go to work. GPS signals would scramble, navigation would go haywire, the weapon would veer off course, miss its target, or just fall into the sea. That is how Russia used Swedish, as a shield, a floating electronic shield that protected Crimea and gave Russia advance warning of any attack coming from Ukraine's direction. So when Ukraine decided to take Swedish down, it was not just hitting an old oil rig for the sake of it. It was punching through the wall Russia had built between itself and Ukraine's long-range weapons. It was clearing a corridor. And to do that, Ukraine needed a missile that could punch through electronic jamming, fly fast and low, and hit exactly where it was aimed. That is where Gungnir comes in. Meet the magical spear. The RBS-15 is a Swedish missile developed by a company called Saab Bofors Dynamics. It has been around since the 1980s, and over the decades Sweden has kept updating it and making it better. The latest version, the Mark IV, is the one branded with the name Gungnir. Here is what makes this missile special. First, the range. The Gungnir can fly more than 300 kilometers. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance from London to Manchester. Ukraine could fire this weapon and hit targets deep in Russian-held territory without ever putting the launch vehicle near the front line. Second, the speed. It travels at about Mach 0.9, just under the speed of sound. That works out to roughly 850 to 1,000 kilometers per hour. It gets to its target fast. Third, the flight path. This is one of the most important things about Gungnir that does not get talked about enough. The missile flies extremely low to the ground and over water. We are talking about 2 to 10 meters above the surface. 2 meters is about the height of a tall person. Imagine something traveling at nearly the speed of sound, skimming the water at head height. By the time Russian radar picks it up, there is almost no time to react. Fourth, the guidance system. Gungnir uses a combination of GPS navigation and a radar system in the nose of the missile that activates in the final moments before it hits. Once the missile locks onto its target, it corrects its own course without anyone needing to touch a button. This is what the military calls fire and forget. Ukraine's soldiers can program the target, pull the trigger, and walk away. The missile handles everything else on its own. But here is the detail that made Gungnir the perfect choice for the Swedish strike specifically. The missile is built to resist electronic jamming. It has its own countermeasures to fight back against the exact kind of GPS interference that Russia was using on that platform. In other words, the one thing Russia was counting on to stop Ukraine's missiles from reaching Swedish was completely useless against Gungnir. Russia brought a jammer to a missile fight. Ukraine brought the one missile in the world that does not care about jammers. The strike footage that Ukraine's Navy released showed at least 2 launches from a truck-mounted launcher on the ground. The truck, the shape of the launch containers, the way the missiles came off the vehicle with a distinctive double exhaust trail during the boost phase. Every single detail matched the known configuration of an RBS-15 launcher. Open-source intelligence analysts confirmed it within hours of the video going public. This was Gungnir, no question. How the strike actually worked. Now here is where things get really interesting, because the attack on Swedish was not as simple as just firing one missile at a platform and calling it a night. What Ukraine pulled off on April 6th was a layered operation, a chain reaction of events, each one setting up the next. And Gungnir was the key that made the whole chain work. When Ukraine launched the RBS-15 missiles at Swedish, the primary goal was not to sink the platform. It was to destroy the electronic warfare equipment on it. Those jamming systems had to go first, because as long as they were running, anything else Ukraine sent toward the platform would be flying blind. Gungnir, with its built-in resistance to jamming, could cut through that electronic fog and hit the jamming systems directly. Once those systems were destroyed, the shield was down. Then came the drones. Ukraine had maritime drones and unmanned systems ready to follow up the missile strike. Without Swedish's electronic warfare running, those drones could navigate freely and hit their targets with full precision. The follow-up strikes pounded the radar systems, the remaining military equipment, and the platform itself. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, announced the attack publicly. He talked about the drone operation. He shared video of the drones striking. What he did not mention, at least not right away, was the missile strike that had cleared the path. Whether that was intentional or not, it meant that for a short while, the world was only seeing half of what Ukraine had actually done. The other half, the Gungnir launch footage, came out a day later, and it sent shockwaves through both military analysts and, almost certainly, the Kremlin. This was smart warfare, not just brute force. Ukraine did not try to overwhelm Swedish by throwing everything at it at once. It thought about the problem, figured out the biggest obstacle, and sent exactly the right tool to remove that obstacle first. Then it sent the follow-up weapons in once the way was clear. The result was one of the most effective strikes Ukraine has carried out against Russian military infrastructure in the Black Sea since the war began. The secret that Russia missed. Here is something that should make Russia's military planners very uncomfortable. Nobody outside of Ukraine and Sweden knew that Ukraine had this missile, not publicly anyway. Ukraine had been sitting on Gungnir quietly, waiting for exactly the right moment to use it for the first time. And Russia, which prides itself on keeping tabs on what weapons Ukraine receives from Western countries, had no idea it was coming. According to reports from Militarny, the Ukrainian Defense Research Group, Sweden and Ukraine signed a deal in 2024 for the transfer of RBS-15 missiles. That deal was barely reported at the time. It was underreported enough that even military watchers who follow this stuff closely missed it. So when the Gungnir appeared in the strike footage on April 6, 2026, it was a double shock. First, the shock of the strike itself. Second, the shock of realizing that Ukraine had been holding this weapon for an unknown amount of time without ever using it publicly. There is also a timestamp detail that makes this even more interesting. The launch footage that Ukraine's Navy released actually shows a date of March 12, 2026 on the recording. The footage was made public on April 6th. That means Ukraine used the missile, kept the footage to itself for weeks, and only released it once the operation was fully complete and the information no longer gave anything away. Ukraine was not just hiding the missile, it was managing the information around it with real discipline. That kind of patient, calculated approach is not what Russia expected from Ukraine 4 years into a grinding war. Russia had been hoping that Ukraine was running low on Western weapons and increasingly forced to rely only on what it could build itself. The Swedish strike blew that assumption apart. Ukraine has its own domestically produced missiles, like the Neptune anti-ship system, and it also has Gungnir, and apparently a growing list of other weapons that Russia does not fully know about yet. Putin has to be sitting there wondering what else Ukraine has that has not shown up yet. That kind of uncertainty is its own weapon. Sweden's 200-year reversal. To really understand how significant this is, you need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because the Gungnir missile is not just a weapon. It is the physical symbol of one of the most dramatic foreign policy shifts any country has made in modern history. For roughly 200 years, Sweden was the definition of neutral. It stayed out of World War I. It stayed out of World War II. It was not part of NATO. It built its identity around the idea that staying out of other people's conflicts was the smartest thing a small country could do to survive in a dangerous world. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and that 200-year policy collapsed within months. Sweden watched what happened in Ukraine and did the math. If Russia swallowed Ukraine whole and faced no serious consequences, the Baltic and Nordic regions were next on the list of places Putin might decide to pressure or threaten. Sweden realized it could not keep pretending that what Russia did in other countries had nothing to do with Swedish security. So Sweden started sending weapons to Ukraine almost immediately after the invasion. By June 2022, it had already committed to sending anti-tank weapons and, critically, the RBS-17, a lighter anti-ship missile. That was the first sign that Sweden was willing to send Ukraine serious firepower, not just helmets and bandages. Then, in March 2024, Sweden officially joined NATO. A country that had been militarily neutral for 2 centuries became a full member of the Western Defense Alliance. Putin had spent years complaining that NATO was getting too close to Russia's borders. His invasion of Ukraine did not stop NATO's expansion. It accelerated it. Sweden is now one of Russia's most active opponents. Since February 2022, Sweden has contributed over $13.7 billion to Ukraine's war effort. It signed the deal for the RBS-15 missiles. It signed a letter of intent in October 2025 for somewhere between 100 and 150 Gripen fighter jets, which are some of the most advanced combat aircraft in Europe. Swedish defense officials have even traveled to Ukraine to sign agreements on jointly developing new long-range weapons. Think about that for a second. Sweden and Ukraine are now working together to design future weapons that will be used against Russia. The country that refused to fight anyone for 2 centuries is now co-developing weapons aimed at pushing Russia back. Putin set out to weaken the West and stop NATO from growing. Instead, he took a country that was completely neutral and turned it into one of Ukraine's most committed military partners. He did not just fail to stop Sweden from becoming an enemy, he is the reason Sweden became an enemy. That is an extraordinary own goal. And Gungnir is what it looks like in practice. What comes next, and why Russia should be worried? The destruction of Swedish matters beyond just the immediate blast radius. That platform was Russia's electronic eye in that part of the Black Sea. With it gone, the airspace around Crimea becomes harder for Russia to monitor and defend. The radar coverage that Swedish provided is now just a gap in Russia's picture, and Ukraine is going to use that gap. Military analysts who follow this closely have pointed out that the removal of Swedish's jamming capability opens up new corridors for Ukraine to strike targets in and around Crimea. Targets that were previously protected by Swedish's electronic umbrella are now exposed. Ukraine is almost certainly already planning what it wants to hit next through that opening. But beyond the immediate battlefield effect, there are bigger questions hanging over this story that nobody has fully answered yet. Sweden is not the only country that uses the RBS-15. Germany operates it. Finland uses it from truck-based launchers, very similar to what appeared in Ukraine's launch footage. Poland flies it. Croatia has it. And every single one of those European countries is an active supporter of Ukraine. Every one of them has sent weapons to Ukraine before. Sweden signed its transfer deal. But have any of the others? Are there more Gungnir missiles quietly sitting in Ukrainian storage right now, waiting for the right target? Could Finland or Germany be in the middle of deals that have not been announced yet? Russia has no way of knowing the answers to those questions. And that uncertainty means Russia cannot simply adjust its defenses to account for a known threat. It has to plan for the possibility that Ukraine could have many more of these missiles from multiple different sources. And then there is the Gripen deal. Sweden signed a letter of intent in October 2025 for up to 150 Gripen-E fighter jets to eventually go to Ukraine. These are genuinely advanced aircraft, capable of reaching speeds above Mach 2, carrying a wide range of weapons, and operating from short runways or even roads. Ukrainian pilots have already been to Sweden to train on them. The first deliveries could potentially happen as early as 2026. Here is the truly alarming part for Russia. The Gripen-E is one of the platforms that can carry the RBS-15 in an air-launched version. So Ukraine could potentially end up with both the missile and the fighter jet designed to fire it from the air. That would give Ukraine the ability to launch Gungnir strikes from the sky, not just from a truck on the ground. The range and flexibility of those strikes would increase dramatically. Sweden is also working with Ukraine on new long-range weapon development. Defense officials from both countries signed agreements in late 2025 to start building weapons together. Whatever comes out of that partnership is going to be shaped by 4 years of real combat experience from Ukraine. That means it is going to be designed to solve real problems that have shown up on the actual battlefield, not just theoretical ones from a training exercise. The bottom line is this. Russia hoped that Ukraine's access to Western weapons would slowly dry up over time. That as the war dragged on, allies would get tired, stockpiles would run low, and Ukraine would be left increasingly relying on what it could manufacture itself. The Swedish strike is evidence that this is not happening. Ukraine is not running out of weapons. It is getting new ones that Russia did not expect, fired from positions Russia did not know were armed, in ways Russia did not have a plan to stop. Gungnir did not miss. It never does. And if the deals already in motion come through, Russia is going to keep feeling the spear for a long time. That is the story of Gungnir, the Swedish magical spear that just rewrote the rules in the Black Sea. If you found this as jaw-dropping as we did, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Things are moving fast, and there is a lot more to come. Here is the question we want to leave you with. If Sweden can go from 200 years of neutrality to co-developing weapons with Ukraine in just 4 years, which country do you think Putin has accidentally turned into his next enemy? Drop your answer in the comments below.